Hi everyone, happy Poetry Day Ireland. My name is Miranda Driscoll. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Solas Nua in Washington, DC. We are still waiting for a few people to join, but I'm just going to give a short intro before we get started. So many thanks to Poetry Ireland, the Northern Ireland Bureau, and the Embassy of Ireland for partnering on this event. And a very special welcome to the Irish Ambassador to the US, Dan Mulhall. I'm delighted to welcome Sinéad Morrissey to Solas Nua today for, especially for Poetry Day Ireland, which for those of you who don't know it, is essentially a day-long annual celebration of the crafted word, spoken and written, presented by Poetry Ireland in Dublin. So of course, this year is all online, which not only gives us in Washington, DC an opportunity to actively contribute, but also to collectively celebrate across the water the power of poetry to bring us together while we are still apart. And on that note, we're coming to you today from Washington, DC, from Northumberland, from Limerick, and from Vermont. So it's almost like we stuck some pins in a map. So just a little bit background about Sinéad. First of all, just to say that our Solas Nua Poetry Group have just completed and had a wonderful discussion about this collection of selected poems found architecture, which was published last year. So highly recommend picking up a copy of that as you go about your travels. So Sinéad Morrissey is the author of 6 collections. Her many awards include a Lannan Literary Fellowship, first prize in the UK National Poetry Competition, the Irish Times Poetry Now Award, and the T.S. Eliot Prize. In 2016, she received the E.M. Foster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2019. She served as Belfast Poet Laureate and is currently Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle University. And that is the short version of her bio, which is just incredible, full of amazing accolades. So we're very excited to have her here today. Sinéad is going to be in conversation with Solas Chair Emeritus Paddy Meskell, who recently stepped down after a wonderful number of years on the board as chair of Solas Nua, but we managed to hold on to him as emeritus, as chair emeritus. So he, as a lover of poetry and a fan of Sinéad's work, I know has a number of questions ready for Sinéad, and Sinéad will also have an opportunity to read from her work. So the event is going to last just over an hour. If you have any questions, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A at any point. We'd love to hear from you, so please do feel free to participate. We'll get to them possibly towards the end of the event, but like I said, put them in at any time. And that's really it from me. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the Ambassador of Ireland, Dan Mulhall, to officially kick off Solas Nua's Poetry Day Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miranda. And may I, first of all, say that I want to congratulate you, Miranda, and welcome you as the Executive Director of Solas Nua. It's one of our great partners here in Washington, D.C. The embassy really values the work that Solas Nua does. And while on that subject, of course, I also want to add to what you said about Paddy Meskell and the great work that Paddy has done over the years in promoting the Irish arts here in Washington, D.C. Solas Nua is a great tribute to Paddy's determination, dedication, imagination, and overall skills in pulling off this remarkable achievement of creating an arts group in Washington D.C. devoted to Irish culture and the arts in Ireland, and presenting the Irish arts to audiences here in Washington D.C. I know that Rex Doherty has also joined as a full-time artistic director and I welcome that, and I hope that I can attend an in-person performance sometime this year. It would be great to get back to live theatre again after a year when we've had to give up those pleasures. So I think the future for Solas Nua is bright, and I also want to say a word of congratulations and encouragement to Dennis Houlihan as he takes over as chairman of Solas Nua. I know Dennis very well during my time here. I've come to know him very well, and I greatly appreciate the work he does, and I know he'll be a fitting successor to Paddy Meskell. But Paddy has got that great title of Emeritus. It's one of those great words that I think, but I know in Paddy's case, it'll be a genuine contribution that he will continue to make to the work of Solas Nua, even though he's no longer the full-time chair. So thank you to Paddy, to Dennis, and to all at Solas Nua, to Miranda, for the work you do and continue to do, and best wishes for the future as you reopen and start to do in-person events again, which would be great. So this is also, of course, Irish Poetry Day, and I've been tweeting a few passages of poetry today. I've also posted a reading of a poem by Greg Delanty, a Cork poet who's lived for many years in Vermont, who spends much of the year teaching in Vermont at St. Michael's College there, and so this is a time when we celebrate the the power of Irish poetry, and I've been trying to do that for the last number of years in my daily Twitter posts, celebrate the great variety and the great success of Irish poetry. And then, of course, we have the news this year of the partnership between the Poetry Foundation in Chicago and Poetry Ireland to develop cooperation, transatlantic cooperation in the field of teaching and writing and encouraging the art of poetry in the United States and Ireland. And this project is called Hope Rhymes. It's a reference to the lines from Seamus Heaney's poem, The Cure at Troy, which President Biden has so often quoted. And it speaks to the power of poetry to heal and to offer solace. And this is a time in our lives when we need the solace that poetry has to offer. So in this spirit, I am delighted also to welcome the fact that the Northern Ireland Bureau, our friends at the Bureau, are also involved in this, fitting that they should be, given that Sinéad Morrissey is a former Belfast Poet Laureate. I've long been an admirer of Sinéad's poetry, and in fact, I first met her when on the 150th birthday of W.B. Yeats, the Yeats Society gathered together all the Poet Laureates from our islands, and all of them happened to be women at the time, which was a remarkable coincidence that added greatly to the occasion. But Sinéad was among that collection of poet laureates. I'm not quite sure what the collective noun for poet laureates is, but anyway, whatever that noun was, we had that gathering, and I was privileged to be present there with President Higgins also speaking at that event. It was the main celebration of Yeats's birthday, and that's when I first met Sinéad. But I have been following her poetry. I've been tweeting her poetry on a regular basis, going back, a number of years. I particularly enjoy her collection called On Balance, and in fact, today I tweeted some words from that collection, from the poem The Photographer, which goes: "The world speaks to me through signs, tiny signs, missable signs. The stones in the river are speaking to me. How many decades has this ox skull lain here? It looks like a crime scene. A waterfall rises as mist off the face of the rock, missing its ending." So the best way I can pay tribute to poets is to read their poetry, to tweet their poetry, to try and draw it to the attention of people who might not otherwise be familiar with the joys of poetry. This week also marks the anniversary, the first anniversary of the death of Evan Boland, a poet that I knew and who came to read at the embassy in London when I was there, and stayed with us in the house which she lived in as a young girl when her father was one of my predecessors there as Ambassador of Ireland to the UK. Now, normally when I pay tribute to Evan Boland, I read her poem, The Emigrant Irish. But because we're today celebrating Poetry Day Ireland, I thought I would read her wonderful translation of one of the first ever poems written in Ireland in the Irish language. That's on Pangur Bán, a wonderful poem, which is a kind of a tribute to, the craft of words and also the craft of mouse hunting on the part of this great cat on Pangur Bán. So from the Irish of Pangur Bán by Ivan Boland. Myself and Pangur, cat and sage, go each about our business. I harass my beloved page, he his mouse. Fame comes second to the peace of study, a still day. Unenvious, Pangur's choice is child's play. Neither bored, both hone at home a separate skill, moving after hours alone to the kill. And when at last his net wraps, after a sly fight around a mouse, mine taps, sudden insight. On my cell wall here, his sight fixes, burning, searching. My old eyes peer at new learning. His delight when his claws close on his prey equals mine when sudden clues light my way. So we find by degrees peace in solitude. Both of us, solitaries, have each the trade he loves. Pangur, never idle, day or night, hunts mice. I hunt each riddle from dark to light. So with that, I hand over to Paddy Meskell, my friend Paddy Meskell, Chair Emeritus of Solas Nua, and the wonderful poet Sinéad Morrissey, whose works I know you will really enjoy hearing about. Thank you. Goramina Magav.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mulhall. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction and for those two wonderful readings. Thank you to Miranda, and a big, big, big warm welcome to you all. Sinead, as Miranda says, is with us from Northumberland in the northeast of England, and I'm from the Midwest in Ireland, just north of Limerick City. And we are delighted to be here with you on Poetry Day, a day in Ireland dedicated to celebrating and appreciating the contribution that poets and poetry makes to our lives. And I suppose in a time where there is more uncertainty and more anxiety and more stress and more just getting by and surviving, it's more and more important each day to conserve and preserve in our own lives a little space for some magic and mystery and beauty, which will be a source of healing and renewal and hope in the future. And the arts do that for many, many, many people, and poetry does that for many, many people. And to Sinead, to yourself, for over 25 years of your wonderful poems, for the thoughtfulness and the richness and the joy that has brought into many lives, including my own, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us at Solas Nua for a conversation about yourself and your work, reading some poems and maybe illuminating them a little with some commentary and some insight. And if you don't mind, Sinead, we'll jump right into it. And I would ask you to read one of my own favorite poems, which is My Life According to You. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe giving us a little context for the poem.
Sure, thank you so much. And just thank you so much, Miranda, for the invitation to be virtually there with you in Washington this evening. And thank you, Ambassador, for that lovely introduction and for tweeting my poems. So yeah, My Life According to You. My daughter is 12, and I wrote this when she was 6. So it's about 6 years old, and we were driving along in the car, and she suddenly started to tell me my biography, but as she had gleaned it. And what was so hilarious about her rendition was that it magnified, things that I'd done that I didn't think were very important. Like I got a cat when I was a child, and completely elided, massive life events. So it was such a fabulous perspective on my life up to that point. And also her language was so euphoric and so colorful that I kind of stole her voice in order to reflect back on myself from her point of view. So there's no punctuation or full stops because it's a rush of a 6-year-old talking. My life according to you. So I was born and was small for ages, and then suddenly a cardboard box appeared with 2 furry black ears sticking out of it. It made me nervous, but I was brave and gave it a bell to play with. And then out it jumped and loved me. It was my cat. I called it Morrissey, Morrissey. It matched my mother's Morris Minor. For the next bit, I was a teenager and then I grew up. I had a flat in Dublin and a boyfriend. He was a vet. Little bed, little kitchen, little towel rack, lots of little cups and saucers. And then off he went to Africa. He sent me pictures of giraffes and of the second tallest waterfall in the world. When he got back, he wasn't my friend anymore. I cried for a week. I was also at university, a bigger place than school with bigger chairs and desks. And when it finished, I found a suitcase. It was red with purple flowers. It had a scarf around the handle. I put in everything I needed, socks and a jotter and snacks. We took a plane across the ocean to Japan to visit Godzilla, where it was summer and boiling hot, and the people all kept wind chimes to make it cooler and rode bicycles to the shops and at the same time held up umbrellas, though it wasn't even raining. And when I met a man in a bright white classroom, the darkest parts of my eyes turned into swirls, then question marks, then hearts. So we got married and went hippity hoppity splat, a mountain, a lake, a desert. We bought a house, a tiny one at first and then a massive one. A baby knocked at the door one night but didn't come in, and then another baby came. He cried a lot. We thought he had a tummy ache. We gave him a bath in a bucket. He was just lonely for his sister to come and keep him company, but you were still floating about in space inside your bubble egg. It had accessories, a switch for going sideways, a switch for going upside down or faster. It was a cross between a sparkly green and a sparkly silver. The moon was very annoying. And then whenever we'd all been bored on our own for long enough, down you came on a path of lightning to finish off the family. You were born on the living room floor at 3 in the morning in front of the trampoline sofa, and I heard them say, "A girl," and sat up straight away. We were both pretty, and I opened out my arms, and that's it really. When you grow up, I'm going to be so busy taking you to the house shop, waiting by the playground gates to bring your children swimming. I won't be any different. I'll keep your room exactly as it is for you to visit. Bric-a-brac collection on the shelf, the bed your father built, the letters of your name in neon appearing on the scene when it's time.
That's just, when I hear you read that, Sinead, you know, if it doesn't work out for you as a poet, you can be a great actor. That's just fantastic. That's just fantastic. As Miranda mentioned, Sinead, last week the Solas Nua Poetry Club had found architecture as their poetry book. So last year was a kind of a milestone, I suppose, for you, and as it would be for any poet, where you look back over about 25 years, over your 6 previous collections, and then you try and create a new collection out of that. So could you share with us what that process was like, Sinead? Was there some architectural precision and structure to it? What did you discover? What surprised you as you look back?
Well, it was a collaborative process. I think that's the first thing to say about it. So there was a conversation between me and Michael Schmidt at Carcanet, who's published all of my books. I've been with Michael since the beginning. So he's intimately aware of the books and the trajectory and the narrative that all of the books kind of tell. So it is a kind of the final contents of Found Architecture is a consequence of that collaboration. And I think what surprised me was I think I get better. You know, I think the book I'm proudest of is actually my last book, On Balance. But looking back, that didn't surprise me so much as just how much poems kind of recur in a way which I wasn't aware of. The same poem kind of got written again. So like an example of that would be, I wanted to start with the first one, Among Communists, because I was raised in a communist family in Belfast during the Troubles, which was very niche, but very interesting, niche and interesting. And I kind of think so much about that determined how I was to be a writer. So that was in that, even though that's not the first poem in my first book, it was the sort of the best beginning for this journey. And then later on in Parallax, I wrote a more specific poem about the annual Christmas jumble sales that the Communist Party would hold in Belfast and sell Soviet bloc products. And that again was it's not only such a kind of interesting and niche world, but such a completely finished world. You know, that whole reality collapsed so suddenly with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in December 1991. So I suppose it made of my past a time capsule and a kind of snow globe, something really, really finished that you can hold up to the light and look at from all different kinds of angles and see new things in it. So that's just one example of a trajectory that's followed through, but there are several. So I think the connectedness of the work surprised me most in the end.
Right. And I see, just to quote something you said in a blog post about that, Sinead, was that something you took away from the process was your struggle for articulacy. That poem by poem, book by book, you kept trying to say things better. Could you just expand on that a little?
I think there's so many times when you don't say something the right way and you try and it doesn't work. But I think part of saying something the right way is not only what you say, but how you say it. So I think one of the big developments for me as a writer has been a kind of sustained engagement with form, with formal structures, and with the way a poem is put together on the page as a visual experience as well as a linguistic experience. So almost as a kind of 3D kind of encapsulation of something. And I think, you know, Yeats, the ambassador mentioned Yeats, and, you know, Yeats had this brilliant line about how when a poem is finished, it comes shut with a click like a closing box. And there's something about complete finishedness when you've not only said what you want to say, but you found the correct vehicle to say what you want to say, so that the two things are in dynamic interplay with each other.
Yeah, very interesting. I was really struck by something you quoted as being something that, quote, niggled with you all your writing life. You said something you could, if I were a pig, what would a pig say? And even more importantly, how might a pig say it? So that is really, that's a very, very evocative thing, Sinead. And one of the themes that strikes me about your work always has been your inhabiting of other people's voices through your poetry. And of course, for me, one of the poems, Vanity Fair, which is an incredible, astonishing poem, really. But could you just speak about this inhabiting other people's voices and then give us the context for Vanity Fair?
Sure, I'd love to do that. So, I mean, I have written poems which are about my life, but I feel like I don't really want to do that, or that I don't want to do that in any particular, I don't want to do it in an unguarded way. And I think even when you do that, something magic happens within the shut box of the poem or the form of the poem, so that it isn't you anymore. It's another entity entirely. And what I've always been drawn to is kind of imaginative inhabiting of other people. And it's that question, you know, if I were, you know, the question about the pigs comes from Les Murray's amazing collection from the 1990s, Translations from the Natural World, when he inhabited the voice of pigs, and he created a kind of language and structure for what a pig would say and how a pig would say it. And that collection was one of the books that really changed my life, because he made me think about how much more ambitious you can be for the poem and for the poem's capacity to articulate otherness. And so there's a whole, you know, that's something that runs all the way through, is me using an I voice, but it's actually nothing to do with myself. So Vanity Fair is, I love the novel, and in the novel towards the end, we're told that a really boring, dull character called Amelia Osborne, when she gets married, Amelia Sedley, she writes this letter to her long-standing devoted lover, William Dobbin, and he changes his mind and he comes back and they get married. And Thackeray doesn't write the letter. So I don't like Amelia Sedley, but I did love William Dobbin. So it was a chance for me to try and think what would Amelia Sedley have written in the letter and how she would have said it. So that's what Vanity Fair ended up being. So let me just find it and I'll read it. So I had to be a boring Victorian for this. And I wrote it in rhyming couplets, which is a hard form to pull off because the rhyme comes so quickly. It can fall quite, you know, it can clang on the ear. But I thought I wanted a very, very decorous box for what she would say. So Vanity Fair. Dearest William, I could begin by hoping you are well in England, and I do, now that the regiment has returned to Chatham. Or I could begin by telling you that reports of worsening weather here are true, that Georgie thinks you wicked and unkind for leaving him that your former servants pine, or that father, though no better, is no worse, etc. But this is not a weather talk sort of letter. It is after 3. The whole house sleeps, even Becky, and I am kept awake 6 weeks by your crippling absence. An irony, I confess, since for all your years of passionate presence, I failed to cherish you. Now that you're gone, Becky, and you were right about her all along, keeps dreadful company. Boorish men who jest and drink and flirt, and she isn't in the slightest shocked by any of it. I keep to my room. I have placed the portrait of George face down on the dresser. I have folded the gloves you left in an innermost drawer, as though they were a gift. Since you spoke of my incapacity for love, I have come to see how my own fierce widowhood was a shell against the world, a kind of carapace made up of pride, stupidity, and cowardice, a stay, if you will, against the kind of attachment such as yours for me deserved. Poor shredded raiment, for if it did not keep me warm, it kept me safe against you and safe against myself. Last year at the opera, it was Dido and Aeneas. I wished to take your hand in a sudden, artless, harmless way that would not give you pause, then didn't. I think I must have sensed the charge built up from a decade's loving in your fingers, though there you sat as solid as an anchor, and feared that touching it would knock me flat. Now I'm scared I shall die without it. Dear Dobbin, come back. Like everything else we do in our mingled, muddy lives, this letter is overdue. Forgive me if my love arrives belatedly, but there is a ship can get you here by Friday, and come all the rain in Christendom, I shall be waiting for you by the viewing platform. Dearest William, put out to sea. Yours, Amelia Sedley.
Well, if you didn't like the character William Sedley, Sinead, you've certainly made her extremely eloquent, passionate, and if I was married, I might fancy her myself. She could write poetry in words like that. But anyway, thank you for that wonderful poem, Sinead. One of the things in your work, Sinead, that really is striking to me is your observation that what we see depends on where we stand. In other words, if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change.
Yes.
And you have adopted that kind of, as you explored history as well, and people's view of history.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit about that influence in your work and your poetry, and maybe end with the wonderful poem Flight?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm very interested in history and the knowability of history, and also how what we know about history is to a certain extent dependent on a kind of active imagination on our part. I'm aware, I think again because of my childhood, because I had a worldview which was at odds to everybody else's worldview that I knew, more or less, apart from, you know, the very close-knit bubble of my family and of the Communist Party circle. But that worldview then shattered. So it was not correct, you know. And I became aware, I just became very interested in this contingency of our knowledge on what we bring to that imaginative act of knowing, and how what we bring to that imaginative act is itself conditioned by our circumstances and by things like our geographical position. So the idea of parallax, you know, that disjunction between position and perception was really lucrative for me as an idea to explore. And so that kind of ventriloquism, or casting your voice, you know, I've done it with various historical moments and subjects, lots about Russia, lots about the Soviet Union, because I'm just very interested in that, but other moments of great political upheaval, like the English Civil War. And again, my sympathies with the Civil War would definitely have been with Cromwell. But I came across an extraordinary account of a kind of fairy tale narrative of Charles II's flight from the disastrous Battle of Worcester, where his forces tried to defeat Cromwell and were destroyed, and he went into hiding. And I came across this kind of narrative of him as a prince. He was the prince in hiding, but it had all these fairy tale elements. So it was a kind of mythologizing of him and his position and of royalty, and, you know, connected back to being God's anointed and to magical properties and all of that. So even though my own politics are diametrically opposite to that as a view, I was very interested in the kind of symbolic power of it. And so I also came across a Scold's Bridle twice in one day, and I never even heard of a Scold's Bridle, and I was in London and I went to 2 different museums and there was a Scold's Bridle in each. And this was this, you know, horrific contraption that was put over scolding women, however you're going to define that. And it stopped them speaking. It was like a brutal instrument of torture, and then the women would be publicly paraded wearing this Scold's Bridle. So in my head, those kind of the fairy tale flight of Charles II and this Scold's Bridle came together. So flight is in the voice of a woman who is a royalist sympathizer who cannot speak. So flight. And there's a little preface which describes this being inflicted on a particular woman. So there he saw one, Anne Bridlestone, drove through the streets by an officer of the same corporation, holding a rope in his hand, the other end fastened to an engine called the Branks, which is like a crown. being of iron with a great gag or tongue of iron, and that is the punishment which magistrates do inflict upon chiding and scolding women, and he hath often seen the like done to others. After the murder of our blessed martyr, after the slaughter of the right at Worcester, his son, the rightful king, went into hiding. Here as a woodcutter, there as a serving man, disguising the telltale milk white of his skin by the dye of rotted walnuts. 1651, the year of our Lord that my husband bridled me, and I have learned to hold my tongue in company. He could not remain unrecognized for long, majesty being so natural unto him, it soon shone forth. But was he loved? He walked upon the bones of England, sought solace at farms and hid in the crowns of trees, and all of nature shadowed him. His enemies sifted the land, and still his face was not revealed. It is my love of him bleeds when I speak out loud. He has stood in a fall of rain while Cromwell's men sang psalms against him and did not venture in. He has seen women sink to their knees and then raise their hand in blessing. My husband desires a sign. But for all his reading of Revelation, I say heaven admits its own, and it is him. The jaw straps tighten. The changeling prince vanished to France. Dead winter dismembers us. Christmas consumes its own bright fire and blazes by its absence. There is too much law to live by, and I have torn my face in two by swallowing silence. My husband leads me through the marketplace as the village women gape.
Thank you for that, Sinead. Sinead, you have said that a 13th century Islamic engineer, mechanical engineer, Ismail al-Jazari, is one of your, quote, presiding artistic spirits.
Yeah.
And you said that one of the things that really struck you about his work was that it hangs in the fulcrum, I think, on the fulcrum between beauty and use. And so is that in your poetry? Do you see that? Could you speak about how that is in your work?
Yeah. So I was in the Met, I was in the States, and I went to the Met in New York, and I was writing on balance. And I came across this exhibition of these extraordinary engineers from the Levant in the Middle Ages. And I came across this book, The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices by Ismail al-Jazari from 1206. And, you know, a title like that, it's the universe speaking to you. So I found out more about him, and he did incredible, his work is the foundation for so many of our kind of modern engineering accomplishments. The camshaft, the crankshaft, all these things he invented. He invented the first accurate clock. So he was brilliant at understanding the physical laws of the universe and how to manipulate them for the good of mankind. But what really struck me in this book with extraordinarily beautiful illustrations was how over the top he was and how unnecessary so many of his appendages to the inventions were. So his first accurate solar clock has, an elephant on top of it, and a servant automaton and bells, and it was just, I just loved that it was so useful and so eccentric and so unnecessary at the same time. And I think art is really useful, but, you know, as both you and the ambassador were saying at the start, in terms of art solace, if its use becomes its primary function and it loses that freedom to be whimsical and strange, it loses a very important part of its essence. And so I'm interested in use and positive impacts of language, but also its frivolity too, and that it remains a space for linguistic play, I think is very important. So in that sense, he's, you know, in both senses of, you know, his use is equally as important, but that it's married with this fantastic appreciation of aesthetic beauty. And so that's why he's really important to me.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was just, you know, coming, you know, from the north of Ireland. I mean, one of the seminal events in Northern Ireland, like, was the Titanic and the launch of the Titanic, and then of course the sinking of the Titanic, and now we have the Titanic Museum as, you know, the best, biggest, most busiest tourism attraction in the whole island, I think. And so one of the things for you, you said poems are moments of artistic expression, of heightened artistic expression. And your poem, The Millie Helen, which kind of covers that moment in Belfast, and it's full of like phrases and words and expressions that are really brilliant. And I would wonder if you just talk about that and then maybe read the poem and the title of the poem also.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the Millie Helen, I'd never heard of the word Millie Helen, and my husband came home and he said, do you know the word Millie Helen? No, don't know the word. It was on the radio, he heard it. And he said, I'm going to commission you to write a poem called Millie Helen. But so first of all, I had to find out what a Millie Helen was. And it's like a fanciful unit of measurement. So if Helen was the face that launched 1,000 ships, a millihelen, as in a milliliter, is the amount of physical beauty required to launch a single ship. You know, and I just love that could even be quantified. And so, you know, coming from Belfast, there is only one ship, and I wanted to go back to the launch of the shell of the ship. So this isn't when the Titanic's being completed. It took 2 years, and the first year was riveting together all those curved planks of steel, creating the shell of the ship. And then once they'd done that with 1 million rivets, it was launched without hitch by hydraulic lever into the waters of Belfast Lough, and it was tugged round to a graving dock, and all of the, you know, the incredible luxurious interiors and the engine and the funnels and everything were then fitted over the course of the next year, and then it set sail. So this is going back to it still in an embryonic state, and also thinking about you know, the terrible irony of the foreshadowing of what was going to happen, because as a contemporary author, you can't visit 1911 innocently. You know, it is framed by our knowledge of what happened, and I wanted to kind of evoke that sort of shadow, and I also wanted to not just describe the launch, but inhabit the launch through language, and try and recreate that experience for the people who were there. It was a ticketed event. But it was never christened, which was White Star Line policy, and people came, and there was a choir, you know, people got tickets to watch, so it was famous already. And I just wanted to see if I could birth the ship in language as it was birthed into history. The Millie Helen. It never looks warm or properly daytime in black and white photographs. The sheer cliff face of the ship still enveloped in its scaffolding, backside against the launching cradle. Ladies lining the quay in their layered drapery, touching their gloves to their lips. And just as they that go down to the sea in ships rises from choir boys' mouths in wisps and snatches, and evil skitters off and looks askance. Now. The switch is flicked at a distance, and the moment swollen with catgut, about to snap with ice picks, hawk's wings, pine needles, eggshells, bursts, and it starts. Grandstand of iron, palace of rivets, starts moving, starts slippery sliding down, slow as a snail at first in its viscous passage, taking on slither and speed, gathering in the atlas capable weight of its own momentum, tonnage of grease beneath to get it, waterborne tallow, soft soap, train oil, a rendered whale, this last the only Miller Helen, her beauty slathered all over the slipway. Faster than a boy with a ticket in his pocket might run alongside it, the bright sheet of the lock advancing faster than a tram. Heavy chains and anchors kicking in lest it outdoes itself, straining up to a riot of squeals and sparks, lest it capsizes before its beginning, lest it drenches the aldermen, and the ship sits back in the sea as though it were ordinary, and wobbles ever so slightly, and then it and the sun-splashed tilted hills, the railings, the pinstriped awning, in fact, everything regains its equilibrium.
Thank you, Sinead. Thank you. Sinead, before we get to the last poem, is the creation of a collection of 25 years of work a kind of a liberation? Like, what does it do for you as a poet looking forward?
Yeah, it does. It seals it off, you know. It kind of puts a string around it. It puts it in brown paper and puts a string around it. And then it's like, okay, but I don't know what comes next. It's like a kind of hiatus moment. So, you know, I find it very difficult to write since On Balance, which I wrote very, very quickly in a kind of flurry, in an inspired flurry of activity. And, you know, I've moved house and I've moved job, and my life has been disrupted in various ways. So I've found writing new poems quite hard, and I have a few, but I don't have that many. And it's really, this gives me kind of breathing room to think about what's next and things I'd like to kind of try and challenge myself with. So I'm writing some essays at the moment. I'm kind of going into like a lyric prose form about all that stuff about my family, you know, the Communist Party and the nature of the sudden ending of 1989 and the kind of reevaluation of the kind of a bit like the select poems puts your work in a package and ties a string. When the Soviet bloc collapsed, it put my entire upbringing into a package and sort of tied the string. So I'm just really interested to sort of revisit that and think about that and think about, you know, the role of memory in that, what is knowable, and differences, you know, in that parallax sense of where you stand, differences between what you see looking back and what you saw at the time, so that difference is not only a geographical displacement, but a temporal displacement as well. So I'm kind of slowly exploring some of those things. And I went to Gdansk. I was really lucky to get the European Poet Freedom Award last year for On Balance, which was translated into Polish by Magdalena Hagel, you know, absolutely fabulous translation into Polish. And, you know, Gdansk it was so fascinating for me to be in Gdansk because of the solidarity movement. and to learn the history of what was achieved through the Solidarity Trade Union in the early 1980s there. And what was really interesting to me learning that was how little I knew about Solidarity. And the reason I didn't know anything about Solidarity was because it fell out of the accepted narrative of my childhood. It ruptured that easy us them West East Cold War partition, and you had a kind of revolution, but it was against the revolution. So I was fascinated to learn in more detail about the history of Solidarity, but I was really interested because it made me realize not only how much of it I didn't know, but maybe why I didn't know it. And as a writer, I think it's just interesting to go into what you don't know. You know, everyone says, write what you know. My dear friend, Kieran Carson, great writer, Irish writer, he died in 2019. He always said, write about what you don't know and use the writing as a form of investigation. And he's been, he has been such an inspiration personally and artistically to me. And the ways in which he does that, he goes into the gaps of what he doesn't know, and he allows the writing to lead him on a journey of discovery. Yeah. And so I'm taking a leaf out of his book, his wonderful, he was a great poet, fantastic translator, but also a marvelous prose essayist and writer. Going back to the Star Factory, to the way he wrote about his childhood on the Falls Road, which was connected to my family. He lived 2 doors away from my dad. And, they grew up, they were part of the same generation, they were part of the same place. So I just love the way he turned his attention to that. He turned his attention to prose. He turned his attention to the sentence rather than the line. And he was never content to rest on all his extraordinary achievements. He was always trying to do something new to him, and to go into that zone of unknown. Yeah. And so, yeah, he's right there, up there, lighting my way.
It's so counterintuitive in the sense, like, we're always told, you always hear, write only what you know, write only what you know. So writing what you don't know as a way of exploration and investigation and gaining insight and understanding, it's just, but it makes perfect sense in some ways, and he's written some wonderful poems about the Troubles, and that is, I think, some of the best about from that period of time, without a doubt.
Yeah. I think his great insight about the Troubles, in his amazing collection, Belfast Confetti, I think his great insight is that it wasn't just violence enacted on people and places. It entailed violence on language. And once that violence is enacted on language, it's enacted on memory. And I just his whole thing about how the streets have changed, the names have changed. He turns a corner and it's not the same street anymore. Therefore, who is he? That's the brilliant insight of that book.
Yes. Well, Sinead, your work has brilliant insights too. It's just, I can't tell you how much time I've enjoyed over the years your work, and now getting to meet you just last week as we prepared, and just to hear you read your poems, talk about them, the context for them, is just adds an extra dimension to it, and I think everyone will be delighted with it. I would ask you to read the last poem, which is Genetics, and maybe speak a little bit about what a villanelle is, that title poem. And then what I'll ask Miranda is then to come back in straight after Sinead has finished the poem, Miranda, and you can come back in and close it, or if there are any questions from the audience. But Sinead, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've been great.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. You've been great too. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
This is a villanelle. I've only written one. I'll probably never write another one. As Elizabeth Bishop said about the great villanelle she wrote one art, I have written a villanelle. I will never write another. And it's based on the children's game with your hands that, this is the church, this steeple, open the door, and these are the people. And it's a kind of meditation on the breakup of my parents' marriage, which happened when I was in my early 20s. So, and my mother went to live in another place, and how I was just meditating on me as the product of their union, that which could not be undone. And the villanelle is a very tight form, but it depends on repetition of 2 lines, 2 refrains, which can either remain exactly the same or which can suffer a slight variation as they make their way down through the poem. And because of the nature of genetic inheritance, which comes from 2 parents, which make their way down through the generations with slight modification, the villanelle just seemed the best box, the best form in which to talk about genetic inheritance. So that's why it's villanelle. Genetics. My father's in my fingers, but my mother's in my palms. I lift them up and look at them with pleasure. I know my parents made me by my hands. They may have been repelled to separate lands, to separate hemispheres, may sleep with other lovers, but in me they touch where fingers link to palms. With nothing left of their togetherness but friends who quarry for their image by a river, at least I know their marriage by my hands. I shape a chapel where a steeple stands, and when I turn it over, my father's by my fingers, my mother's by my palms, demure before a priest reciting psalms. My body is their marriage register. I reenact their wedding with my hands. So take me with you, take up the skin's demands for mirroring in bodies of the future. I'll bequeath my fingers if you bequeath your palms. We know our parents make us by our hands.
Thank you very much, Sinead.
Wow, thank you, Sinead. That's one of my favorite poems of yours, actually. So it's a really lovely way to end the event. Thanks so much to both of you. I could definitely have kept it going a little bit longer. Just really lovely to hear you read, and thanks, Paddy, for those really thoughtful questions, and to both of you for your generosity in the conversation. I think I love the idea of you as a ventriloquist, because this idea of kind of inhabiting historical events through language is just so beautiful. And also I was struck by the way you talked about kind of use versus frivolity or even playfulness, I suppose, because it reminds me when I was in art college, we had one class as a group of artists and critics and writers, art writers. We had one class with architect students, and there was a real kind of jaw-dropping moment when the two kind of the artists and the architects were kind of talking about use, and the idea that an artist can build a bridge, and an architect can build a bridge, but the architect's one has to actually stand up. Whereas the art is not saying that art is frivolous, but that there is that playfulness that can be explored, perhaps. And really, in terms of questions, I have a question, and it strikes me, I suppose, just like listening to you read is just such a joy. And I think there's something very kind of magical that happens when you hear a poet, particularly, I think, reading their own work, because, you know, I think when a novelist or a fiction writer or somebody who's writing essays put something out into the world, they kind of know an audience reads, and it's kind of a solitary sort of practice. And then a musician puts something out into the world, writes something, and kind of has control about how it's heard, because they play it or they sing it. And then it strikes me that you're kind of like a composer is somewhere in between, because with poetry, it's so often it's read by, not necessarily by the poet, by other people. So you have kind of less control over that. So I suppose my question is really like, how do you feel about reading your own work, and does it give you more kind of, does it take back the control? Because I think when you put a poem out into the world, you kind of let it go, right? So do you read it differently each time? How does it give it a kind of another layer? Really, I suppose that's my question in a roundabout way.
I think that for me, I love reading the poems. It's almost like they're not finished when they come click with a shut on the page, but they are finished when I know them. So I know them in my head, and they settle into a kind of rhythm in my head. So they will be, I'll say them with slight variation, but each one kind of has its own pattern for delivery inside my head. And I know that when it goes out into the world and it'll be read in everybody else's, you know, internal sonic rhythms, I don't have any control over that. And that's fine. I mean, I'm really happy that poems go and have afterlives of which we know nothing. You know, I think that is a really, it's a privileged position to be an instigator of those. And I like the fact that I don't have control over it too. Yeah, there's just something about being able to, for that moment of the interaction at a reading, to own it completely by myself and give it the voice that I heard it in.
It's wonderful, and it's it's a generosity to put it out into the world and know that it's gone, and people can kind of do whatever they want with it. But also that's why I think it feels very magical to hear you read it, because it's read as it was kind of intended to be heard or to be read. But I just think it's a really interesting space, poetry, between all of those other disciplines that can kind of slip quite comfortably between all. So thank you for that. I don't think there are any other questions at the moment, but I suppose I am conscious of the time and of your time, and it's dinner time for you in Ireland. And just to say thank you so much. It was wonderful to meet you. Thank you, Paddy, as well. I think you played a blinder in that role. I know you two connected very well. So it's been lovely, and I just want to thank you again. Thanks to Ambassador Mulhall for his wonderful opening remarks. And from us at Solas Nua, just to say that we're producing live theatre again. We're presenting live theatre again, which is really very exciting for us. So from the 20th of May to the 12th of June, we'll be presenting our first in-person event in quite some time, written by Deirdre Kinahan, In the Middle of a Field, will be directed by Leili Lippard, and it's in a field, a park on Peace Street Beach in Washington, DC. So have a look on our website for details. Tickets are limited, so please do jump in there while you can, because I think myself included, everybody's very excited about just the idea of going back to see something in person, and it being a socially distanced event outside is really exciting. So it's given us all a bit of a thrill. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much, Sinead and Paddy, and enjoy the rest of your Poetry Day Ireland.
Thank you, Sinead. Thank you,
Thank you, Paddy. Have a lovely
Thank you.
evening. Thank you, Miranda.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.